Gawley Bridge, West Virginia, 1931. A man is coughing blood into the sawdust at his feet. His lungs are filling with something that has no remedy and no reversal, something that the industrial medicine of his era had already named and classified and documented in federal bulletins that the company employing him had almost certainly read. The compressed air drill in his hands is still running, still screaming its high metallic note through the unventilated heading of a tunnel bored through a mountain of nearly pure quartzite. The dust hanging in the lamplight around him is not ordinary rock dust. It is silica at 97 to 99% purity, particles so fine they measure 1 to 10 microns across, fine enough to slip past every biological defense the human respiratory system possesses, fine enough to reach the alveoli and stay there permanently. The body's response to their arrival is to wall them off with fibrous tissue. The fibrous tissue accumulates, nodule by nodule, and the lungs stiffen and shrink against that accumulation. A man who was breathing freely and working hard in the summer of 1930 is drowning on dry land by the winter of 1931, and he is not alone in that drowning. There are roughly 3,000 men somewhere inside this mountain, and the dust is the same for all of them, the same white cloud, the same particle size, the same biological mechanism operating identically in every pair of lungs that draws breath in those headings. To understand how this happened, how a single engineering project running less than 2 years in a single West Virginia county could leave 1,500 men with lungs turning incrementally and irreversibly to stone, you have to go back to 1927, to a drought, to a corporate boardroom in New York, and to a decision made by men who understood geology and electricity and quarterly returns, but apparently not, or not sufficiently, and not with sufficient concern, the biology of breathing. Union Carbide and Carbon Corporation in the late 1920s was not a marginal enterprise operating at the fringes of American industry. It was one of the largest chemical and industrial conglomerates in the United States. The company ran electrochemical operations at enormous scale across multiple states, operations that required reliable, cheap, and continuous electrical power at volumes that most utilities of the era could not guarantee with consistency. In 1927, the company's engineers and planners began developing a hydroelectric project along the New River in West Virginia that would eventually become the Hawk's Nest Tunnel, a diversion tunnel 3 3/4 miles long, bored through Gawley Mountain, designed to capture the New River's natural descent, drop it 162 vertical feet through the mountain, and drive turbines at a generating station constructed below. The engineering logic was rational and, in purely hydraulic terms, elegant. The New River dropped through a natural gorge formation that the local topography had been carving for millennia. A tunnel through the adjacent ridge would capture that drop without dams or impoundments of significant scale and convert gravitational potential into electrical output with mechanical directness. The geological surveys came back and confirmed what the company's engineers needed to know about the rock through which the tunnel would pass. The Hawk's Nest quartzite was extremely hard, extremely stable as a structural medium, and extremely rich in silicon dioxide, 97 to 99% pure silicon dioxide. That purity meant something beyond structural engineering to Union Carbide's metallurgists and process chemists. High-grade silica was a critical raw material for the company's electrochemical furnace operations, used in the production of silicon-based industrial alloys at facilities that consumed it in quantity. The tunnel was not simply infrastructure connecting the river to the turbines, it was a mine. The original engineering plans for the project called for a tunnel bore of approximately 32 feet in diameter, a dimension sufficient for the hydraulic requirements of the diversion and standard for a project of this type. The decision to widen the bore to 46 feet increased the cross-sectional area of the tunnel by more than double, substantially increasing the volume of rock removed and therefore the volume of commercially valuable silica available for extraction and sale. That change transformed the fundamental nature of what was being constructed. The tunnel was no longer an infrastructure project that incidentally passed through valuable rock. It was a silica mining operation that incidentally generated hydroelectric power. The mountain was worth more as a commodity than as an obstacle, and that calculation, made in boardrooms and on engineers' drawing tables far from Gorley Mountain, would cost 1,500 men their lungs. Construction was contracted to Reinhardt and Dennis Company, a Virginia-based civil engineering firm with experience in large tunneling and infrastructure projects, and active drilling began in earnest in 1930. The workforce that Reinhardt and Dennis assembled for the project was drawn substantially from black men recruited from Alabama, Georgia, and other Deep South states, men facing the specific and compounding economic desperation of the early Depression years, men who had been promised steady wages in an era when steady wages were becoming a memory across much of rural America. Approximately 75% of the total tunnel workforce was black. This composition was not accidental or incidental to how the project operated. The allocation of labor inside the tunnel followed the racial hierarchies of the American South with the same mechanical precision that governed every other social institution those men had encountered. Black workers were assigned predominantly to drill at the face, the active cutting edge of the tunnel heading deepest in the mountain, where the rock was freshest and the dust was at its greatest concentration, and where whatever ventilation existed had already been depleted by the distance it had traveled from the portal. White workers were more frequently assigned to tasks at or near the tunnel entrance, in better air, with shorter exposure duration to the heaviest silica loading. The men who drilled fastest were placed closest to the face and closest to the dust. The compressed air drills that Reinhardt and Dennis deployed in the tunnel headings were standard industrial equipment for the period, machines designed and optimized for a single operational purpose: removing rock as quickly and continuously as possible. Dry drilling, operating a drill without the water injection systems that suppress dust at the drill bit by capturing particles before they become airborne, was meaningfully faster than wet drilling. In ordinary rock, the difference in dust output between dry and wet drilling was a significant but manageable hazard question. In quartzite, at 97 to 99% silicon dioxide, running dry drills in an enclosed heading without adequate ventilation was not a marginal risk increase. It was the generation of a lethal aerosol at industrial scale, sustained across full 10 to 12-hour shifts with 3,000 men cycling through the exposure zone. The mining and industrial hygiene literature available before 1930, including multiple publications from the United States Bureau of Mines, documented with considerable specificity the relationship between silica dust concentration, dry drilling practices, inadequate ventilation, and silicosis. The knowledge existed in the professional literature. Wet drilling was practiced in some mining operations where awareness was higher and enforcement existed. Respirators capable of filtering fine silica particles had been developed and were commercially available. Ventilation standards for dusty underground headings had been described and discussed in engineering and industrial hygiene journals for years before the first Reinhardt and Dennis drill bit touched Gorley Mountain's quartzite face. None of these measures were meaningfully applied at Hawk's Nest. The 46-foot bore ran full drilling crews simultaneously across multiple headings. Shift lengths held at 10 to 12 hours without reduction. Workers were reportedly visible to one another only as silhouettes moving through dense white clouds that the lamplight caught and made briefly beautiful before a man inhaled them into his permanent destruction. The dust settled on skin and clothing and food. It coated the interiors of nostrils and throats. It was not a background condition to be managed. It was the medium of daily existence for every man working the face, and it was working on their lungs from the first shift forward. It acted invisibly and without pain at first, laying down the fibrous groundwork of a death that would arrive with terrible speed. This is twist number 1, the origin irony that drives everything that follows and that cannot be softened or explained away by complexity of circumstance. The Hawk's Nest tunnel was, by every corporate and engineering metric available to Union Carbide and Reinhardt and Dennis, a success. It was completed on schedule. It came in under budget. It was a demonstrable feat of Depression-era industrial execution, a massive civil project completed with speed and efficiency at a moment when economic conditions made large-scale construction an act of organizational will. When it was finished, it did exactly what it was designed to do. It diverted the New River, dropped it 162 feet, and fed electricity to Union Carbide's electrochemical operations with reliable continuity. The machine worked perfectly. That was the catastrophe. The very factors that made the project a documented engineering success maximum drilling speed across all shifts, maximum workforce density in the headings, maximum utilization of available working hours, and minimum expenditure on dust suppression, ventilation infrastructure, and worker protective equipment were precisely and without exception the factors that maximized lethal silica exposure for the men doing the drilling. The efficiency and the death were not separate outcomes of the same project. They were the same outcome measured in two different units. The faster they drilled, the more efficiently they killed. Inside the tunnel, the physiological timeline unfolded with the brutality that the acute form of silicosis imposes when exposure concentrations are extreme. Silicosis, in its acute presentation, triggered by short-duration exposure to extraordinarily high concentrations of fine respirable silica dust, does not require the decades of accumulation associated with the chronic form familiar from long-career coal and hard rock miners. At the concentrations present in the Hawk's Nest headings, acute silicosis presented fatal symptoms within months of initial exposure. The mechanism is direct and irreversible. Silica particles lodge in lung alveolar tissue and trigger an inflammatory immune response. The body attempts to isolate the foreign material by encasing it in collagen-rich fibrous nodules. The nodules multiply and coalesce as exposure continues, and the lungs lose progressively their elasticity and their gas exchange capacity. The victim does not simply become short of breath. The lungs stiffen into structures that can no longer adequately inflate and deflate, and the heart strains against the increased resistance until it fails. A man who was strong and working at full capacity in June of 1930 could be dead of respiratory and cardiac failure by November of 1931, a timeline that shocked even the physicians who observed it and that was unlike anything the existing silicosis literature, built primarily on chronic long exposure cases, had fully prepared anyone to encounter. Local physicians in communities around Gorley Bridge began seeing this timeline in their consulting rooms and their hospitals beginning in 1931. A local doctor, whose intake records from the period appear in subsequent investigative documentation, had begun encountering men presenting with severe and rapidly progressing respiratory disease within a year of the tunnel's active drilling phase. Company medical personnel attached to the project attributed deaths in documentation to pneumonia, to tunnelitis, a term that named the location rather than the mechanism, to influenza, and to causes categorized broadly enough to avoid the diagnostic precision that would have named what the men were dying of. Death certificates signed during this period frequently omitted silicosis. Men were buried without that word attached to their records. Families were approached with settlement offers before grief had fully registered as something that could be legally actionable, and the settlements were structured to prevent what the legal system would later call discovery. Reports from the subsequent litigation period document settlement figures that averaged between $30 and $80 per claimant in many resolved cases, across approximately 265 settlements handled through Reinhardt and Dennis, and each settlement came with a signed legal release that foreclosed further claims. The industrial apparatus for suppressing knowledge of the deaths operated with the same efficiency as the industrial apparatus that had caused them. The settlements came with one condition: silence. Bernard Allen, a local undertaker working near Gorley Bridge during the tunnel's construction period and in the years immediately following its completion, documented a spike in deaths among young men in their 20s and 30s, men at the physical peak of working life. That surge in business stood out against the baseline mortality of a rural West Virginia community with a starkness that required no professional training in epidemiology to register as aberrant. Allen's observations were precise in their way. They were also institutionally homeless because no regulatory body was structured to receive them or required to act on them. West Virginia's workers' compensation system did not comprehensively cover the affected workforce. The federal government had no occupational health enforcement mechanism with jurisdiction over private construction contracts of this type and scale. State health authorities had no mandate that would have compelled investigation of what a local undertaker's ledger was recording. The tunnel was finished in 1931. The DIing had only just begun. Here the story reaches its second and most structurally damning engineering irony, twist number 2. The one that makes Hawk's Nest not merely a story of corporate negligence, but a story of a physics-derived lethality built directly and inescapably into the project's central commercial logic. The property that made Hawk's Nest quartzite valuable to Union Carbide was its purity, 97 to 99% silicon dioxide. That figure made the rock worth extracting commercially, Worth the bore-widening decision, worth the additional drilling time and cost that the larger tunnel required. That same purity governed the particle characteristics of the dust produced by drilling it. Rock with high silica content is hard. Harder than limestone, harder than sandstone, harder than most of the rock formations that tunneling projects encountered. Hard rock, when fractured by a compressed air drill operating at high speed, shatters into finer particles than softer material does. Finer particles remain suspended in air for longer durations before settling. Finer particles, when inhaled, penetrate deeper into lung architecture, past the bronchi, past the bronchioles, into the alveolar sacs where gas exchange occurs and where no clearance mechanism exists to remove them. The hardness of the rock, the commercial property that the Geological Survey had confirmed with such precision and that had driven the bore-widening decision, was simultaneously the physical property that determined the particle size of the dust generated. That particle size determined airborne suspension duration. Suspension duration determined depth of lung penetration. Depth of lung penetration determined how quickly men died. The purer the silica, the harder the rock. The harder the rock, the finer the dust. The finer the dust, the deeper it went. The deeper it went, the faster men died. The engineering virtue and the human catastrophe were not parallel consequences of the same decision. They were the same physical property of silicon dioxide expressed in two registers simultaneously, commerce and mortality, and they could not be separated from each other without abandoning the project's commercial rationale entirely. The first civil lawsuits were filed in Fayette County courts beginning in 1932 and extending through 1933. Attorney Harley Skeel pursued early litigation on behalf of affected workers and their families with the limited tools available to plaintiff attorneys in Depression-era West Virginia, and survivor Oscar Chitwood, who would later testify before Congress, was among those whose documented medical condition became part of the emerging legal record. The legal system provided no meaningful remedy in this period. The combination of inadequate workers' compensation coverage, the legal releases already signed by families who had accepted settlement payments, and the financial inability of affected workers and their widows to sustain extended litigation against a corporation with Union Carbide's resources meant that most claims either failed or settled on terms that benefited the defendants. Union Carbide and Reinhardt and Dennis maintained through this period that they had operated without negligence, that the hazards of silica dust in concentrations present at Hawk's Nest were not sufficiently understood at the time of construction to impose a duty of prevention, an argument that prior to 1930, Bureau of Mines literature on silicosis and dry drilling directly and specifically contradicted, and that the welfare of the workforce had been a company priority. The national story broke with force in 1935, when Philippa Allen, a social worker and investigator who traveled to Gorley Bridge to document the conditions and consequences of the tunnel project among the affected workers and their families, published her findings in The Nation magazine. Allen's reporting was the first account to place the full human scale of what had happened at Hawk's Nest before a national readership, and it arrived during the high tide of the New Deal's concern for labor conditions. At that moment, the federal government's relationship to workplace safety was being actively renegotiated, and Congress was theoretically receptive to evidence of industrial catastrophe on the scale Allen was describing. Congressional pressure mounted through the latter half of 1935. In January of 1936, a subcommittee of the United States House of Representatives convened formal hearings to investigate the Hawk's Nest disaster. And those hearings generated a documentary record of extraordinary scope and specificity. Witnesses described tunnel conditions with physical precision, the white dust clouds, the dry drilling, the absence of respirators, the inadequate ventilation, the speed with which men had sickened, and the speed with which they had died. The confirmed death toll accessible through coroner and county death records stood by 1936 at 476. That figure almost certainly undercounted actual mortality because deaths had occurred across jurisdictional lines, because death certificates had been systematically signed without accurate cause attribution, and because the disproportionately black composition of the drilling workforce meant that many deaths had occurred in communities with weaker documentary infrastructure and weaker institutional memory. Estimates of actual total mortality, incorporating deaths not captured in official records, have ranged from 700 to over 1,000. Beyond the dead, the congressional record documented 1,500 or more living workers exhibiting active silicosis, men still breathing but with lungs in progressive, irreversible fibrosis, men whose remaining years had been measured out and shortened by the dust they had breathed in the headings of Gorley Mountain. Dr. Leonard Greenberg, an industrial hygienist called to testify before the subcommittee, addressed the state of professional knowledge regarding silica hazards and permissible dust exposure standards with directness, establishing for the congressional record that the technical basis for preventing what had happened at Hawk's Nest had existed in the professional literature before the project broke ground. They counted the dead carefully and recorded the living carefully, and they did not change the law. This is twist number 3, the one that moves the Hawk's Nest disaster from the category of industrial accident into the category of institutional revelation. The 1936 congressional hearings produced a documentary record that occupational health scholars and labor historians still cite as one of the foundational primary sources in the field. They documented the deaths and their mechanism, the tunnel conditions and their design, the prior professional knowledge that had existed and been ignored, the settlement structure and its suppressive function, the racial stratification of exposure and mortality, and the specific medical progression of acute silicosis in the affected workforce. It was a thorough and damning accounting. It produced no federal legislation. No criminal charges were filed against Union Carbide or against Reinhardt and Dennis. No enforceable national standard for permissible silica dust exposure emerged from the hearings. The subcommittee's work dissolved at the committee level, absorbed into the legislative friction of a period crowded with competing New Deal priorities, and the structural reforms the hearings implied: mandatory wet drilling on federal construction projects, enforced ventilation standards, regulated dust exposure limits, and comprehensive occupational disease coverage under workers' compensation did not materialize as federal statute. The machine, meaning the complete system of tunnel, labor structure, corporate legal apparatus, and regulatory vacuum, was measured with precision and documented with care, and was not redesigned. The record was complete, the remedy was not. In the years following the hearings, the Gorley Bridge community absorbed the weight of the disaster in forms that the congressional record could not fully capture. The men who had drilled the tunnel and survived the drilling were sick and growing sicker. They could not meet the demands of physical labor. They could not recover because silicosis does not permit recovery. The primary wage earners of hundreds of households, men recruited from Alabama and Georgia in their 20s and 30s, recruited specifically for their physical capacity, were disabled at ages when their children were still young and their debts against company housing were still real. Families with black workers received disproportionately less from the settlement and compensation process, consistent with the racial hierarchy that had governed every dimension of their employment from recruitment through burial. Some families relocated, others remained in place without resources in communities whose primary employer had extracted what it needed from the mountain and moved on. The mountain stood unchanged and functional. The community it had consumed to build itself was scattered and diminished. Martin Cherniak, a physician and historian, whose 1986 book, The Hawk's Nest Incident, remains the most comprehensive scholarly account of the disaster and its aftermath, documented the long-term community health record, the accumulated human cost across the decades following the tunnel's completion, and the institutional failures that had compounded the original industrial catastrophe with continuing neglect. Cherniak's work gave the disaster the historical permanence and analytical depth that the absence of federal legislative response in 1936 had denied it during its own era. The regulatory reform that Hawk's Nest had demanded and not received in 1936 came eventually, but across a span of time that itself constitutes an indictment. The decades between 1936 and 1970 saw continued silicosis mortality in hard rock mining, foundry operations, sandblasting, and construction work across the United States, with states varying enormously in the seriousness and enforceability of their dust standards, and with industry self-regulation producing outcomes that reflected the same cost-benefit logic that had governed Reinhardt and Dennis on Gorley Mountain. The Bureau of Mines published guidance, and the industrial hygiene profession continued refining exposure standards, but without federal enforcement authority, these remained recommendations that the economic pressures of industrial competition could override. It took the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970 to establish federally mandated permissible exposure limits for silica dust in American workplaces, with enforcement mechanisms, inspection authority, and penalties for violation. 34 years after the 1936 congressional hearings, 39 years after the first men began dying in the headings of Gawley Mountain. It took 34 years for the federal government to say in enforceable law what the men of Gawley Bridge had said in blood. The regulatory history continued beyond 1970. OSHA's original silica standard was substantially tightened in a comprehensive final rule published on March 25, 2016, reducing the permissible exposure limit to 50 micrograms of respirable crystalline silica per cubic meter of air as an 8-hour time-weighted average, a standard that occupational health literature has explicitly connected to the foundational significance of the Hawk's Nest case as the event that first made the full industrial-scale lethality of uncontrolled silica exposure undeniable in the American public and legislative record. 85 years after the drilling began, the Hawk's Nest tunnel itself was never decommissioned. It still carries water through Gawley Mountain. It still drops the New River 162 vertical feet through the rock that 3,000 men drilled with their hands and their lungs. And it still drives turbines in the generating station below. The industrial logic that built it, capture the river, extract the rock, generate the power, minimize the cost, was never invalidated by what happened to the men who executed it. Only the human cost of that logic was eventually partially legally constrained by the regulatory architecture that the deaths had made necessary. The silica extracted from the widened bore served its intended purpose in Union Carbide's electrochemical furnaces. The electricity generated by the diverted river powered the company's operations for decades. The machine worked then, and the machine works now, and the only sound inside Gawley Mountain today is the sound of moving water. The river the tunnel borrowed in 1931 and never returned, running through a bore cut 46 feet wide through nearly pure quartzite by men who breathed the quartzite into their blood and carried its weight home in their chests. Somewhere in the accumulated legislative record of American labor law, written across decades in the technical language of permissible exposure limits and enforceable standards and revised regulatory thresholds, 1,500 men's lungs are still doing the work of proof.